One. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. And today, joined by Laura and Anelise. Great to have you here. And let's hear from you first. And if you could introduce yourself. So, Laura, would you like to go first?
Sure, Alan, thank you. My name is Laura Elmquist. I'm from Las Cruces, New Mexico. I've lived here all my life. I've traveled a bit and lived in California for a while, but always returning to my beloved home state of New Mexico. So I work for Aprendamos, and at Aprendamos, we serve children. We do therapy of all kinds. We have a program that works with children with autism and other programs as well. And so I'm super excited to be here with my daughter and you, Alan.
Thanks, Laura. Anelise.
Hi, I'm Anelise and Cooper. I'm Laura's daughter, and I live here in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I like to paint and I like to read.
Great. What's your favorite book, Anelise?
One of my favorite books is The Edge Chronicles by Paul Stewart.
Oh, what's that about?
It's a fantasy series. It's very kind of Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings-ish. It's very good.
Okay. So you like things that kind of give your imagination a bit of freedom. Is that feels like that
definitely.
kind of right? Cool. Okay. Well, I've got the ValuesJam card deck here. So what I'm going to do is tip out some of the cards. So Anelise, how many piles would you like me to put in front of me?
How about 3?
3. 3 sounds good. And Laura, from my left to my right, would you like pile 1, 2, or 3?
Pile 1.
Pile 1. And so, Anelise, I've got 7 cards here. Which number, 1 to 7?
6. 6.
Ooh. So this is the one we've got.
Oh.
Risk-taking.
Awesome.
Oh, what a brilliant card to have for a multi-generational conversation. All right, so the way this works is we'll start with the first question, and either of you feel free to speak first according to what comes to mind. What does risk-taking mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like?
Well, I think it means that you have to put something at risk in order to achieve like something that you want or something that you need. And like sometimes that can look like sacrificing something for another person, or it can look like something that could be seen as reckless, but in the end it has like the desired outcome, or you can really see that that person is fighting for a cause.
Okay, and Laura, either anything that's come to your mind or in response to what Anelise just mentioned?
It's interesting. When I first saw risk-taking, the first thing that came to mind was something more on the side of negative for some reason. I associated it with like doing things that could potentially be damaging or harmful. But then I noticed when I had that thought pop in my head, I also paused for a moment and thought, okay, well, risk-taking can also be doing things outside of your comfort zone that potentially could have a great reward. And it could be something socially good, or it could be something good for your career, or something good personally that pushes you further and to do better. So I had those two things happening in my head right now.
Yeah, and what Anelise mentioned right at the beginning made me realize it's about these two sides of the story kind of thing. And it's, on the one hand, you've got the potential benefits that could be realized. And then on the other hand, you've got the consequences or what could go wrong. And it's that kind of, how do you play that balance? And actually, this has reminded me, you know, that very sad story about the submarine that just happened off of Boston. There was a post over the weekend on LinkedIn about this, talking about how, you know, basically it was saying that was too much of a risk to take. And what they had not done was take expert advice from another party, because they had relied on their own perception. You know, the guys that had built the thing had gone with what they thought. And so this post was kind of saying, if they had just taken outside advice, this need not have happened. And my response was, well, if you take advice, it doesn't mean to say it's going to be good advice in the first instance. You know, that's the first thing. And then secondly, how do you actually balance this potential benefit versus the potential cost when we don't have perfect knowledge, and often we're thinking about the unknown? So, Anelise, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's really true about how sometimes it's not always advice. Like, advice should be taken, like, with everything else in mind. You shouldn't just rely on someone else's advice. You should also rely on your own judgment with the advice. And I think that ultimately you just have to weigh them, and there's a strong like capability, like potential that it could go either way. You have to like weigh what you'll lose and what you'll gain from it, and whether you're okay with losing and whether you want this more.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Laura.
Yeah, and I think my personality is such that I'm more risk averse with everything, and so that really plays into my decision making, and sometimes it keeps me from, you know, wanting to do or from doing more. Like I've always said, oh, if I had an opportunity to go up into space, would I take it? No, I wouldn't. I would not. Would I go deep sea diving? No, I wouldn't. So, um, yeah, I think it's interesting. And advice, I mean, advice is just advice, whether it's sought after or not. I mean, people will always offer their advice, but whether or not we decide on our own to take the advice or to listen is one thing. And then when I think about the submarine, I'm like, okay, they built it, right? So they have to have faith in what they're doing. And so, and also maybe egos into play, because it's like they built it, and then someone else may say, well, it's not, you know, it's not prepared to go down as deep or do whatever they want it to do, but you've built it and that's your craft, you know. And how do you take the you know, someone saying that your product isn't going to do it, and you have millions of dollars at stake? I don't know if that's at all what happened, or if that, but that, you know, that's another aspect of risk taking as well, and peer pressure, you know.
And when Anelise was talking about understanding what you can lose and whether you're happy to lose that or not, I think it is really at the heart of this, because, you know, in a situation where we're talking about loss of life, then perhaps more consideration should have been given to that risk. Whereas if, you know, if the loss or the consequence is not as extreme as that, then perhaps you're able to be a bit more easygoing and take a risk. And Anelise, I don't know if you do you ever play like video games and stuff like that?
Occasionally, sometimes, yeah.
And do you? I don't, but I've got this kind of perception that video games which involve, like, you know, either racing or killing other people and stuff like this, I've got this intuitive thing inside that's telling me that it encourages people actually to take risks, because in a game, you can crash, but you can just start again. And so there's no consequence. And I'm interested to hear from you whether you think that that translates into life decisions, or whether people keep it squarely in the gaming box and it doesn't affect decision making in life. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it definitely could, because like something that you see a lot with like older generations, something that I see and like that I've observed throughout like years of watching my grandparents and watching my parents, is that they're very cautious with life decisions, and that they don't go into things head first. They always stop and pause and take a moment to think things through before they do anything. And they talk to each other and they work things out, and they make sure that this is a good decision before they go and do it. And then as I'm looking like around in my school life and in at the people around me in my everyday life, my peers, and I'm watching the decisions that they make, they don't they don't pause. There's no stop and think about it. They just go headfirst into it, like it's a game, like it's something that they can just go back and start again. But it's not, and that's why I feel like there's so much that they need to stop and pause and like wait before they do things, because that's how bad things happen. And I wonder if it is from being raised on video games and seeing that it doesn't really matter your choices because you can go back and fix them later, or you can procrastinate and leave it till later.
Mm. Do you do gaming, Laura?
Um, I, I have, yeah. I did when I was her age, but they were quite different. And we do have a Wii, but that's so outdated now. It's like old school now.
Yeah.
And I'm always cautious on the Wii because I want to win. I don't want to kill myself off and then have to start over. I want to finish and I want to win. So I'm cautious. But
And what about risk? So the other thing about risk taking. So again, Annalise, when you were talking about your peers, I don't know why I've got these two examples in my head, but it's like, sometimes you see people doing cliff jumping, so jumping off of a cliff into the water. And imagine that it's a bunch of young people, and some of them are saying, "Oh, come on, let's do it," and the others are saying, "Oh, yeah, but what if?" And he said, "Oh, don't be such a spoiling the party type thing," and then they go and jump, and it's absolutely fine. And so they've taken the risk, it's been fine, and you're the one that's hung back, and everybody's like, what are you, look, it's absolutely fine, look what you're doing. So there's something in many instances that's appealing about risk taking, as long as it works out okay. Do you relate to that?
Um, yeah, I think like recently, is this happened a while ago, a couple weeks ago, but my little cousin was in town, and so my nana took me and my little cousins to the trampoline park. And at the trampoline park they have this big airbag, and there's like this inflatable diving board, and it's very wobbly. And so my little cousin, she's 7 years old. She goes on there and she jumps off and she's like, "Oh, that was so fun. Let me go again." And so she goes again and again and again off this thing. And I'm sitting here on the corner like, I'm not going off of that. That is wobbling everywhere. And then she was like, "Come on, come on." And so I'm like, "No, I don't want to." And then so she pulls me up onto this diving board, and I'm standing on it and it's so wobbly, and I'm scared because I'm looking off of it and there's like a good 8 feet between me and the airbag. And she was like, "It'll catch you, it's fine." And I was like, "I know, but the situation feels scary, even though I know that I'm going to be caught." And so she tells my other cousin, she was like, "Push her off." And so my other cousin pushes me off, and I fall on the airbag, and it was absolutely fine, and I enjoyed it, and it was fun. But it was still scary to be on top of that little wobbly thing, and I think they should really invest in a non-inflatable the non-inflatable diving board. But the sensation of being on top of there and then finally just sucking it up and just going off of that thing was like rewarding because it was in fact like it was fine at the end, but it didn't make me any less scared.
Yeah. Laura.
No, I don't know. I'm just um gosh, just the I'm just getting a vivid picture of the whole thing that just happened there at the
Yeah.
trampoline. I wasn't there, so but how fun, I mean, I think um looking back on childhood, that certainly did take so many more risks and was so carefree and had wonderful experiences. And even on up into my college years, um, I took an internship in Mexico City, and there's 25 million people, and I'm from a community this small. And I landed in Mexico City and got on a bus on my way to where I was going to be staying. And I thought to myself, what have I got myself into, as I looked at the city? And, but I was there and I made a wonderful experience out of it. And maybe it's the not knowing piece, sometimes that helps.
There's this
Yeah.
thing that like psychologically humans have where if you're like standing on a cliff, it's called the call of the void. And so if you're standing on top of a cliff and you're seeing all of this thing, there is like some, it doesn't really matter how much, but there is some part of you that will always call you to jump in. It's a little bit haunting, but I always think about that every time I'm on top of those wobbly diving boards at trampoline parks with my cousins.
I think that trampoline park example is a really good one, and it reminds me of a story. I was with my youngest daughter when she must have been, I'm guessing, around about 7 years old. And there's a ride at a theme park where you basically get taken up 100 meters in the air and then it drops. That's the ride. So we're on this thing, and to create the suspense, the rise to the top is very slow. It just cranks and cranks and cranks. So we were probably about, I don't know, 5 meters from the top. And Evie said to me, I've changed my mind, Daddy. I don't want to do this anymore. So of course you can't get out, you can't go back. So that was not an option. So of course, what I think I tried at the beginning to say, well, we've come this far, it's not much farther to go now. It'll be okay. Then she started to cry and say, I really don't want to do this. And I was like, well, it's going to happen. There's no way for us to go back down now. And so let's just see what happens. Anyway, we dropped. She got out at the bottom, got out, big smile on her face. Can we go again? Can we go again? And the reason I tell that story is because there's something about in Anelise's story, or in that story, where the risk was perceived, but actually perhaps there wasn't a real risk. And so that's the ideal scenario, where you get the thrill, but you're safe at the same time. Whereas in New Mexico City, for instance, that's not necessarily the case. And Laura, I think the point you made was that as we get older and we've more experience perhaps of what can go wrong, that might be influencing us versus when we're younger and we don't know what can go wrong so much. So like you say, we're unconscious and maybe take more risks like that. What about the metaphor, though? Because what does risk-taking look, feel, and sound like? What images come to mind? What sounds come to mind? What feelings come to mind when you think about risk-taking?
For me, it's that like adrenaline kind of feeling where you're like, or that like butterflies in your stomach thing when you're on like a roller coaster and it just goes down after a big hill. Um, Or it could be like jumping into that airbag and hitting that airbag once you jumped off of that cliff, um, with the trampoline park example, or getting off the ride at the bottom of the theme park ride.
Okay. And what about sounds or images?
Hmm.
Laura, what about you?
I get an image of me and my friends in his fast car, piled, six of us piled in this really fast car going 100 miles an hour or more on the highway, and just, yeah, go. That's the image that pops in my head about risk taking. But also, I remember a time of um, when I think I was in Las Vegas, and I was at the roulette table, and I was making small little bets, and the person next to me was making huge bets. And my little pile kept growing and growing and growing. And that person eventually lost all their money and went
Wow.
away. And it was just because I was just making these small little bets, but I was winning, and I was winning a little bit at a time. But by the end, I had a pretty good amount,
Yeah.
and betting all of it on one number, and they were losing, and they walked away all frustrated. So I don't know. I mean, just different pictures in my head about risk, what that conjures up and image wise.
Mm. And I've got like Anelise, mine was the that rush and the fast heartbeat and the butterflies in your tummy, that kind of thing. And sometimes fear, actually. Um, and Lara, what you just said makes me think about how, we talk about risk taking and as if it's like one thing. But I think that card, the roulette or whatever it was, is a brilliant example of where perhaps you were taking calculated risks, and so you were stacking the odds in your favor as much as you could, perhaps, whereas the other person was maybe being a bit reckless about their risk taking. And that's why the outcome was different for you and that other person. So when you think about risk taking potentially being so different in those two examples, it's like a bit weird that we talk about it as if it's this one thing.
I know. And then also just kind of considering uh, maybe the background of each person. Like, we were both doing the same thing, right? We were both playing roulette, but perhaps that person had just won, $2,000 and didn't invest anything and had this money to just kind of blow, whereas I didn't, and I had this money set aside for weeks, that I was going to save up to do. You never know what the background is behind
Yeah.
why that risk was taken, because I might do the same had I had some money to just kind of blow, or something like that. It's interesting what kind of frame of mind or what background or what story is behind each of these things that we do, behind risk.
And relativity as well. I think that's a big part of this because, if you're a millionaire, to lose $2,000 is different than if you saved up $2,000 for the last year. So that relativity, I think, is a really important aspect of risk as well. Let's move on to another question then. So where have you noticed a lack of risk taking, Anelise?
As far as like a lack of risk taking, I see that in myself sometimes because like sometimes I don't want to do things or don't want to go on field trips because I'm afraid of missing school because I had a hard class that day that I didn't want to miss, but then I missed out on going to Meow Wolf and going to Santa Fe. And then I realized later that the benefits of that field trip would actually outweigh the losses of missing that one class and having that one teacher nag at me for the rest of the year. But I mean, it was a trip to Meow Wolf, and a trip like you would go as a liaison to Santa Fe for like the Mesa Club, to ask them for funding, um, and then they would take you to Meow Wolf and do some other stuff in Santa Fe. And I was like, oh, but I have Jones, and I was like, I don't want to do that. But then I realized that I was like, missing one class is compared to the trip, you know? That happens all the time. I see that in like a lot of people, and like a lot of times when they skip out on things because they think the losses will outweigh the benefits, but then in retrospect, the benefits outweigh the losses.
That's fascinating, actually, because that kind of contradicts what we were saying earlier. You know, earlier we were saying maybe as you get more experienced, you become more risk averse. Actually, that shouldn't be the case if what you've just described happens, because you could equally be learning that where you do take a risk, good things can happen. What's your take on that, Laura?
Yeah, definitely. Similar example of a colleague that works, 50 hours a week and has leave to take and has an opportunity to take a holiday, but won't because is afraid of the workload coming back, and was trying to encourage this employee, this colleague of mine, to think about like years down the road where are you going to say to yourself, wow, I worked 50 hours a week every day and I poured my heart and soul into this work, but I missed out on it. Or are you going to say, I had an amazing trip with my dad and my brother in Australia? I mean, how, are you going to be proud of are you going to be wanting to reminisce about the amount of work you did and burnt yourself out? Or are you going to really cherish those moments you had potentially to have in Australia with your brother and dad, And I guess it wasn't enough to convince my colleague, but then it also reminded me that, these are the moments, these are the experiences that are worth life, worth living versus the other. So yeah, it's kind of the same, contradictory thing where it's not so much a risk, but it's like, what are you foregoing,
Yeah, so I think I remember the term is opportunity cost. So, it's sometimes we don't realize or we don't think so much about what we're giving up through doing what we do. So, like in this example that you've just given, by working that week instead of taking it off, what are you actually foregoing? And there's also something about the difference between the known and the unknown, because, your colleague knew what was involved with another week's work, another 50-hour week. And so there's a certain amount of comfort around that, because although you're working hard, you know that what's going to happen more or less, and it's kind of easier to deal with. Whereas the unknown is, well, what's going to happen if I do go on holiday? And is it going to be okay? And are we going to get on all right? And so you can play this story about the uncertainty of it not being attractive. And yet, what we do know is such a small percentage of what there is. It's like sometimes we convince ourselves that we know so much, whereas in fact it's tiny. And so I don't really understand why people don't jump into the unknown a bit more, even though it feels like it's with risk. If you play your card game strategy, where you're just betting a little bit each time, and you're being sensible about it and not being reckless about it, it can actually be very rewarding. And sorry, one final thing on that is you also reminded me, and this happens a lot in ValuesJam, both of you, just to share this. So many times people say, Oh, you've just reminded me of this that happened, a long, long time ago. And a psychologist in New Zealand told me that because values conversations are very deep, it might be that previously lapsed neural pathways are being reconnected as a result of the conversation, which causes a memory to come to the surface. So this one, I worked in an investment bank, and the remuneration setup was that you got your salary, but then you got a fairly significant bonus based on the performance of the business every year. And I'd never worked in a business like that before. And so when I got the bonus, I remember this so clearly. 50% of it got put away as savings. Then, of the 50% that was left, 50% went on a holiday. And then what was left, 50% was split between the kids for a treat. And I just had all these 50% things. But actually, 50% of it was put away. So it was like that. I think maybe it's your card game again, Laura, that made me think of that, because I didn't just go and think, yay, and blow it and have a great time, but tried to achieve a bit of both. So Anelise, you're at a much earlier stage in your life than your mum and then me. So what's your take on this approach to risk at the moment?
I think that's a good approach because I think if you can, you should at least try to minimize the amount of risks that you have to take because then there's loss and benefit. Um, but like a lot of times, like my friend, when we were little, my friend used to get $5 of allowance every week, and then I was like, oh, why don't we like go hang out somewhere? And he was like, okay. So then we went to like a store or something. We went to an ice cream shop. And then I was like, oh, what do you want? He was like, oh, I can't get anything. I don't have any money. And I was like, so I bought him an ice cream. And then I was like, why don't you have any money? And then he was like, because I spent it all the second my mom gave it to me. And I was like, why would you do that? I've been saving my money up for like all this time so that we can go have like and do fun things together at the right times versus just spending everything all at once. And then as a kid, I didn't get allowance, so I would earn money, and I would earn money from my small business that I would make at the market, and so I would save my money, and then we would go do these things, and then I would bring it out, and then I would be happy to do things with the money that I earned from the market, my proceeds and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think it was an interesting, like I couldn't see why he would spend it all at once. And then he was like, well, it's money, it's for spending. And I was like, yes, but then you don't have anything to do later.
Yeah. I think there's something else that comes to play there as well, in that a bit like you, Annalise, I've always had to work hard to get whatever money it is to be able to spend. And here you go. It's happened to me again. I remember being 14 and my mum telling me that I could get a belt for my birthday. And in the town or the city that I was brought up in, there were like two high streets of shops. And I did 3 tours of every single clothes shop, seeing which was the best value for money belt that I should get, rather than just walk into the first shop and then that was it. Whereas somebody who maybe came from a wealthy background, that would have been a total waste of time, right? Because they've like, all I want to do is get this belt. So I've got the money and I don't care if it's the best one or not. So there's something about when you have to work hard for something, it means more somehow. Laura, do you relate to that?
Oh yeah, most definitely. Still to this day, I mean, I always want to get the most bang for my buck. So it's like, well, why aren't you picking out the thing? Well, I haven't taken a look at all of these options yet. I need to see, but it's really it is. I mean, it's how I feel like it's how you're brought up because or how or your your environment and and you know, that all plays into it. I mean, money wasn't something that we had either growing up, and this is what you got, this is what you ate, and this is what we could afford, and you just did. But now, earning your own money, it's like, okay, I want to make sure it's being spent. You know, I'm not going to just be frivolous with my money. And it's interesting as a household too. That's all. It all plays together. Like, my husband earns the money, I earn the money, and then how we spend it, you know, as a household, all those decisions have to be made. Um, and I think we balance each other out a little bit there.
And there's something there also about how this might be a bit off topic, but what you've just described, I'm thinking that I'm kind of still like that now. You know, even though I don't have to necessarily be like that, it feels wrong to kind of make the choice without being reasonably sure that you've got a good deal. You know, whereas some people are like, oh, just go and do it. Doesn't really matter. I still can't do that. So go on, Laura.
No, it does. It does have a feel to it, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, it doesn't feel right to just go, here you go, I'm taking it. I don't know. Yeah.
So let's on the ValuesJam cards, there's an opportunity for us to create our own question. So Laura, would you like to give this a go then? Ask your own question about risk taking, beginning with who, what, where, when, why, or how.
Okay, so what's the biggest risk you would take if your reward would be a lifetime of happiness?
Whoa. So Anelise, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
That brings a lot of ideas to mind. Most notably, that you can't have happiness without also having sadness. And so there's no real way to create pure joy without also having the other side of that. And so my response to that would be, I wouldn't take any risks because I would want to experience life at its fullest, and that includes the ups and downs.
Whoa, what a brilliant answer.
Oh, I agree. That's brilliant. Love it.
So if I didn't hear that brilliant answer, which has just blown my answer out of the water completely, how would I answer that question? If the reward was happiness for the rest of your life, how much would you risk? Right, this might sound as though I'm cheating, because my answer is pretty much the same in that we have no way of knowing what might or might not make us happy. And so it would be foolish to risk anything based on that assumption. So I'm with Anelise, slight variation on it, but I'm really comfortable to take the risk that the life as I'm going to lead it is going to be good enough. And what about you, Lara?
Yeah, I can't, it's almost like I'm looking for something to quantify it, and I can't, so that I can't make a decision, you know?
Yeah.
One way or the other.
Yeah. Well, here's one for both of you, actually. So I was at a conference, it was in Toronto around about 8 or 9 years ago. And I was sat with a professor who told me that he offered his fresh intake of students every year this option. You live until you're 70 years old in good health, and on your 70th birthday, you die. Or you take the risk and live a normal life. Which would you choose? So let me ask that question to the both of you.
I would take a risk and live a normal life.
Same.
Okay. I think I said the other answer. So, and he asked me to be fair, I should have explained this. He asked me to answer as if I was an 18-year-old student, coming in.
Yeah.
But what he said was that 80% of students chose to live a normal life and take the risk. And we were just talking about how it was really interesting that that effectively you were giving up the guarantee of well-being, live till 70 but no further, compared to a normal life, which, what is a normal life? Do you normally get to maybe in your 80s? Is that what you would regard as a normal life expectancy or not?
Well, for me, it wasn't about the life expectancy, because it's knowing that exactly when and where you're going to die. Because I don't want to live my life preparing for my death. I want to live my life in the moment and get everything that I can out of it, not just, and especially having to prepare others for my death, or choosing not to prepare them for my death. That's another thing, like knowing I was going to die and not telling one, or knowing I was going to die and telling everyone about it, which only proves my point of living preparing for your death.
Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it? Because I wholeheartedly agree with what you've just said. On the other hand, I think if we had a greater sense of knowing, perhaps we would be encouraged to do more of what we want to do. So a friend of mine, I've really lost touch with him in the last decade or so, but I worked with him for 5 years and we were really good friends. He shared with me a bit later that his then wife had died. And he said that his biggest regret was that they always talked about what they were going to do when they retired and, all of this sort of stuff. So in his situation, if he had known that that was going to happen, maybe he would have done different stuff and he would have felt better about her passing. So it's a really fascinating, although a bit morbid, area to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's take it a bit more uplifting then for our penultimate question. So, how could more risk taking improve the world?
I don't know. I think for me, I think risk taking sort of can be seen as a way to expand horizons, right? I mean, and by doing so, gives us more experiences, gives us more awarenesses, um, perhaps more empathy, even. And how can that play out into the world? Well, I think if people had more of this, more experiences, more awareness, more empathy, um, more learning opportunities, it would definitely help. It would help the world. When we stay isolated in our own little bubble, we don't. We tend to just have one point of view, and we need more. We need more.
Anelise?
I definitely agree with that. Like expanding on that, like pushing outside of your comfort zone, um, when you can, just because sometimes people stay in these like little boxes in their ideas, and they're not open to seeing what other people have to say or what they have to think about. And so if you take that risk and branch outside of those boxes that you consider yourself to be in, you'll not only see more of the world around you and the people around you, but you'll be more open to change.
And I before you said that, I had the phrase comfort zone in my head, because people say it's only when you're outside of your comfort zone that you grow, or that you learn, or that you improve. But being outside of your comfort zone, by definition, is taking a risk because it's not comfortable. So I totally agree with that. And in terms of the world, I've got something about how regulation and legislation holds us back. So I'm talking to a healthcare company at the moment about potentially working with them. And one of the issues they've got is that their employees are too focused on adhering to all of the regulations. And as a result of that, they're not giving the best service to the patients. So they're kind of almost obsessed with not making a mistake, rather than bearing it in mind, but making sure that you look after the patient. So Laura, I keep coming back to your casino, but it is that, not being the reckless one, and not feeling that you should never take a risk, but doing it in this balanced way so that you achieve both. So we wrap up a Values Jam with a final question, which is this. Time has flown, right? It's like 50 minutes we've been talking. It's just gone like that. So either of you, whoever wishes to go first, what are you encouraged to do differently about risk-taking as a result of our conversation?
Well, this has definitely encouraged new perspectives on risk taking and what is a risk. Also how these choices that you make in life and where they lead you, and just thinking about things all the way through, but also pushing outside of your comfort zone and finding new perspectives, like my mom said.
Okay. So Anelise, if I can, I'm going to push you a little bit, because your response, I understand the general direction that you're going in. What I'd like to know from you is, what's the first either baby step or concrete thing that you can do in honor of what you've just described? So when might you have the first opportunity to do a small thing in that direction? Do you want to think about that and let your mum answer? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, please.
All right. So Lara, what about you? What are you encouraged to do differently about risk taking?
I think, looking at risk in a more positive way, honestly. I've always associated risk as sort of not as a positive thing, necessarily. But really, this conversation has enlightened me to think about it in a different way, in a different perspective. And how might I take more risk, in a positive way? Like you say, getting out of the comfort zone, because there's opportunities every day for me to do that, and many times I don't, so yeah.
Okay, and same follow-up to you as to Anelise. When do you think you might have the first opportunity to do that, to look at risk in a more positive way?
No, I think, daily in my work, for sure. It's a risk to speak up, but it also is the right thing to do it oftentimes, especially when it involves, other people, and potentially the harm that something might be happening for others. When I have an opportunity to speak up and help, instead of saying, well, that's kind of risky, how will I be viewed, what will be said, will I upset my boss, will I upset the status quo. Well, honestly, it's a risk, yes, but it's the right thing to do. So push more in that direction, to use my voice.
Okay. And do you have a forum or a meeting that's imminent where you might have the chance to do that if the opportunity arises?
Yes, weekly.
Okay. So you've got
Weekly.
it.
These are good, challenging conversations that are happening weekly. And
Okay.
so, yeah, opportunities there, definitely.
Okay. Anelise, have you had any further thoughts?
Well, the one that popped into my mind was about how I talked about the field trip that I didn't go on because I was afraid of missing that class. Well, it comes up again. They do it every year, so I'm gonna go on that field trip.
Yeah, good one. And mine is kind of twofold. What this conversation has brought through for me is to look at any risk in a wider context. So rather a bit like Lara, you were talking about your colleague and the holiday, and I thought the way you framed it with them was brilliant. That at the end, well, in many years to come, what are they going to remember? Are they going to remember that they stayed on and did another week's work, or are they going to prefer to remember that Australia holiday? So when things happen that I sometimes consider to be a risk, I'm going to put it in the perspective of the whole, so that perhaps it's not the risk that you thought that it was. That was the first thing. And then the second thing is to be a bit more bold. So I had been thinking about with this healthcare company, I'm going to Boston to spend half a day with their senior leadership team. And I was thinking about some of the slides that I could use. And I found myself saying, oh, that might be a bit too bold or forward, but actually I'm going to use them as a result of this conversation rather than not. And if they don't like it, they don't like it. But what I won't do is come away from there thinking, if I had used those slides, I wonder if the outcome would have been different. So that's mine. And thank you very much for this fantastic Values Jam. I'm glad you took the risk to join me for it.
It was absolute joy. It was wonderful. I've learned so much from you both. Thank you.
As have I.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Bye, Alan. Cheers.